Hi, I'm Scott Althaus with the Klein Center for Advanced Social Research at the University of Illinois, and I'm presenting on behalf of my 5 co-authors a paper looking at the vulnerability of mainstream American news coverage to the strategic communication goals of terrorist organizations. And we're very grateful for the funding that we've received from these 3 agencies through the Digging into Data Challenge Transatlantic Platform program that has made this research possible. Terrorism is a communication phenomenon. It is a tactical choice, one tactic among many that could be chosen, made by non-state actors who are pursuing political goals. And they choose to pursue these political goals using the tactic of terrorism in order, they assume, that the violence that comes from these events is going to generate publicity with certain kinds of characteristics. Publicity that is going to exploit fear in a target population, and that is also going to shape the perceptions of multiple audiences in ways that are favorable to advancing the strategic communication goals of the terrorist organizations that produce these events. So the Responsible Terrorism Coverage Project is an effort of which this paper is a part to try to address a fundamental problem in the societies that are targeted with these kinds of strategies. The problem is that the easiest way for mainstream news organizations to report on terrorist events is precisely the kind of coverage that these terrorist groups are trying to produce. Coverage that is dramatic and focuses on the bloodiness of the attacks, that stokes fear in populations, that elevates the threat of the group and raises uncertainty about the future if the group's concerns are not addressed in some way. That's the kind of coverage that terrorist groups want to promote. And our effort here is to help journalists to understand how they can provide citizens with the information they need, because these events are newsworthy and citizens need to know about them, but without giving terrorists the kinds of attention that they want. So this paper has 2 goals. One is to trace evolving patterns of news discourse elements over long spans of time that are susceptible to the strategic communication tactics of these terrorist organizations, and to also understand how violent non-state actors in the way that they try to target certain kinds of news discourse elements, whether they are successful at doing so by manipulating the frequency, severity, and novelty of terrorist events. So there are 2 basic strategies that terrorist groups can use against a country that is not undergoing a large-scale civil war. One of them is known as an attrition strategy. Basically, we can think of this as scaring a population. And the hope here is that terrorist attacks will produce fear responses, will underscore the powerlessness of the target audience to do anything about it, and to showcase the disunity among the targeted in-group, so that these different reactions on the part of a targeted population would motivate their political leaders and governing institutions to capitulate to terrorist demands in order to reduce the pressure that their populations are under. The second strategy is almost the polar opposite of that one. It's a provocation strategy, trying to piss off a target audience by cueing outrage, by elevating the amount of moralizing language that's in a discourse, and by cueing the solidarity of the targeted in-group. And the hope is that by doing these 3 things, that is going to force a targeted government to overreact and respond to a terrorist attack in a way that is going to advance the political goals of the terrorist group that is fomenting it. So both through attrition strategies and provocation strategies, terrorist groups are trying to bring about some leverage on the political institutions and leaders that hold the keys for getting those terrorist groups the political outcomes that they want. So we have 3 research questions in this paper. One is just whether the overall baseline levels of discourse elements that are relevant to these strategic communication goals that terrorists pursue, whether they supply a baseline of vulnerability or resilience to a society, to an audience set for a particular news outlet. The second is whether that baseline shifts in response to a particularly catastrophic terrorist attack. And here we're looking at the impact of the 9/11 attacks in New York City, which is the hometown to the newspaper that is the focus of our analysis, the New York Times. Thirdly, we want to understand how the frequency, severity, and novelty of terror events might be associated with weekly variation in the news discourse elements that terrorist groups are trying to shift. So to start, we need to have a good understanding of what are the distribution of terrorist event characteristics that are occurring over this time. And for that, we turn to the Global Terrorism Database that is a comprehensive collection of terrorist events that have occurred around the world between 1970 and the end of 2018. It's total right now over 190,000 separate event records. We divide those records up into 6 regions of the world, and for each region we calculate a weekly count of terrorist events that have just happened, a weekly count of event-related deaths associated with those terrorist events that have just happened. And then we construct 2 measures looking at the novelty of both events and deaths over the period of the past 52 weeks. So the first one looks at the novelty of this week's terrorist events, the number of them, by scoring them as a percentage of all the terrorist events that have happened over the past 52 weeks. And we have a similar measure that does the same thing for event-related deaths. We are looking at the New York Times, and we're looking at the entire population of New York Times published output from January 1st, 1945 through the end of 2018. That's nearly 5 million articles containing over 4 billion tokens, and within that set, we're drilling down to identify violent non-state actor event discourse. Here, this is stories that reference violent non-state actors according to a query that we've developed, and that also are classified as relevant for civil unrest activity by the Klein Center's SPEED machine learning classifier. This was developed to detect civil unrest and political violence, and so the combination of references to violent non-state actors and the presence of a positive indicator from this classifier that there's an event that is violent or some other form of civil unrest, it defines the set of stories within the New York Times that we're looking at. And that sums up to be just over 266,000 articles over the span of 74 years. We're looking at 4 measures of news discourse. The first is the percentage of moralizing words that show up in these news stories using the Enhanced Moral Foundations Dictionary that's just been produced. We're also looking at the percentage of tokens in each of these stories that correspond to first-person plural in-group references, references to we, us, ours, ourselves. We're also looking at the percentage of words in these stories that score on the fear and anger lexicons developed by the NRC team in their emotion lexicon. And for each of these 4 measures, we've human validated them so that we're confident that the interpretations we're offering algorithmically are also corresponding to how human readers would understand the outcome of these algorithmic processes. The humans see things the way that the algorithms were designed to produce content for. So first, just looking at overall changes in the percentage of tokens in these stories that scores on the Enhanced Moral Foundations Dictionary, we see that moralizing language has been consistently elevated in New York Times discourse since the 1980s. There was a period in the 1950s and the 1960s where the degree of moralizing language is going down over time, but following the 1980s, it's been consistently elevated in the decades since. When it comes to in-group references, we find that they've been somewhat more common in showing up in this discourse since the 1980s than before, but overall, these kinds of words, we, us, ourselves, are relatively unusual to find in New York Times discourse about violent non-state actor events. We see stable levels of anger in these articles that we're looking at, but levels of fear go up. Since around the 1990s, there's been a pretty consistent elevation, small but consistent elevation in the amount of fear discourse in these articles. So that brings us to the larger question of whether terrorist event characteristics can predict weekly variation in news discourse, because in the figures that I've just shown you, the lowest smooth lines are very stable, but the weekly perturbations of individual measures around those lines suggest there's a great deal of variation that could be explained with reference to these terrorist event characteristics. So we're going to end up with a multivariate model that is going to allow us to analyze these relationships in a fairly sophisticated way. We're going to use multivariate OLS with year-specific fixed effects that includes 2 lags of the dependent variable to address problems of serial autocorrelation in these data. And we're going to run 2 sets of models. The first set is going to look at the weekly event counts and the logged weekly death counts for each of these regions. It's a total of 6 variables for weekly events, 6 variables for logged weekly event deaths, each of those 6 corresponding to one of the 6 regions in the world. And then we have a second set of models that's doing basically the same thing, but using the novelty measures on event counts and the weekly death counts to assess whether novelty has any different kind of impact on discourse than just the raw counts. And before we go to the multivariate results, I wanted to just turn to a set of simple Pearson correlations that we ran. When you look at all these different permutations and all the different models, and we're doing separate models for pre and post 9/11, we get a total of about 192, not about, exactly 192 correlations that we can estimate out of these data. And only about half of them attain conventional levels of significance, even though we have several thousand weeks within this data set with which we could generate some kind of significant result. So it's very telling that only half of these simple correlations attain conventional levels of statistical significance. A second finding is within this set of 192 correlation coefficients, the significant correlations are going to be more likely for events that happen overseas than for events that happen in the United States. A third pattern is that many of these correlations change, sometimes dramatically, before and after 9/11, and that's going to lead us to want to run separate models for pre-9/11 discourse patterns and post-9/11 discourse patterns. The fourth trend that comes out of the correlation coefficients is that even the significant correlations are substantively small. The average among that set of significant correlations is just 0.17. So we want to see whether these things hold when it comes to the multivariate analysis, and we find that they hold, and that the small substantive importance of these effects is very clearly indicated through the multiple regression framework. So what I'm showing you here is the set of 16 different models. The top rows are event and death counts, and the bottom rows are the novelty versions of those counts. We've got within each of the 4 dependent variables for the New York Times discourse elements, we have separate models for pre-9/11 and post-9/11. And within that, we're looking at the R-squared values from when we first drop in the baseline model, which is the 2 lag-dependent variables plus the year-specific fixed effects dummy variables. And then we want to see how the R-squared value changes once we drop in for each of these models the 12 measures from the GTD event characteristic variables. And what we find is that of these 16 models, only 3 of them show a statistically significant increase in R-squared values when we drop in those GTD measures after first including the baseline variables in the models. And of those 3, the largest change in R-squared is only 0.028. Less than 3% of variance could potentially be accountable from these GTD measures alone. And from that, we conclude that the apparent effects week by week in New York Times coverage of variations in these characteristics of terrorist events have substantively little impact on what the New York Times is reporting. So in conclusion, do terrorist attacks produce desired results? The answer is no, at least not in the New York Times. Weeks that have more events, more deaths, more novel attacks were hardly different than weeks that have no attacks at all. And weeks that have terrorist events that are targeting the United States or Americans or that occur in the United States were hardly different from weeks where there were none of those events at all, or events that are occurring in other places. So in returning to the title of this paper, we can conclude with confidence that within the pages of the New York Times, it is just as hard for terrorists to scare us as to piss us off.